And now, here's your host, Chip Tatum.
Hey, good evening, folks, and welcome to the Pegasus File. I'm Chip Tatum. I'm your host tonight. Hey, we've got some things to talk about tonight. You bet we do. There's a lot to talk about. So what do you think the catalyst is for everything going on up in the good old US of A these days? Huh? Mass shootings, department store shootings, sidewalk drive-bys. What is going on? Maybe, just maybe it has something to do with the fact that during the campaign, then candidate Trump said he wanted to downgrade the Patriot Act. Downgrade the Fed's ability to tap us. But surely our own government wouldn't be behind any of this to protect their interests, would they? If not them, then who? We'll be back right after this. In May 1973, the Senate Watergate Committee started broadcasting its hearings. It took just over a year for the 18.5-minute gap to unravel the conspiracy and the House Judiciary Committee to start the impeachment process. On August 8th, the 37th POTUS became the first president to resign from office. During that process, two key links between the CIA and Watergate came to light. E. Howard Hunt was one of them. It was only in hindsight that the true complexity of the intelligence and OC network at the time had revealed itself. For instance, long-term associates of Lansky, Cellini, Chesler, and Groves were all working with the CIA and William Mellon Hitchcock through the Miami-based Resorts International. Resorts International had set up a secondary company, a private intelligence firm that was staffed with ex-CIA, NSA, BNDD, Interpol, and Justice Department. At the same time, Hitchcock also held an account at the Paul Whelan Bank, Castle Bank and Trust in the Bahamas. Castle Bank was a funding cutout for the off-the-book covert CIA operations and an offshore money laundering facility for OC. Other Castle Bank clients included Richard Nixon, Hugh Hefner, Howard Hughes, Chiang Kai-shek's daughter and son-in-law, as well as numerous entertainers, drug dealers, and Republicans. The Washington establishment couldn't seem to break the loop. Stumbling from one very public crisis to another, the trust in government needed for a democracy to function was evaporating fast. And by 75, nothing short of public bloodletting could calm the nerves. The Rockefeller Commission was set up to investigate CIA activities within the U.S. and was followed by the Church Committee to study governmental intelligence activities. The NEDSI Committee was then replaced by the Pike Committee, which sat on the U.S. House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. These were all followed by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. There was a slight problem with the process. Unlike the citizens are accused of breaking the law, when the establishment is accused of doing it, it gets to investigate itself. So the Church Committee relied on the CIA's own internal investigation into the CIA's role in drugs trade. Not only that, the scope of the investigation was the CIA involved in crack Perhaps unsurprisingly, the CIA found no evidence that any CIA operatives have ever been involved in the delivery of crack cocaine to the United States. It's true. Crack is different than cocaine. To be fair, there were a few cynics even in Washington. Soon after getting his feet under the desk, the new DCI and future vice president, and father to a president, was asked point blank by Congresswoman Betty Abzug what involvement the CIA had in international drug trafficking. He replied by citing a 1954 agreement with the Justice Department which allowed the CIA to act in secret and block prosecutions of any crimes it commits in keeping the nation secure. Apparently, anyone trafficking drugs while working on or for or on behalf of the CIA was immune from prosecution, or even subject to discovery motions in court, both nationally and internationally. I know. I had a get-out-of-jail-free card. Knowing that the DEA had just been set up in a manner that effectively gave the CIA the final say on narcotics trafficking, Congresswoman Abzug saw the flaw almost immediately. She later wrote, "It was ironic that the CIA should be given responsibility of narcotics intelligence, particularly since they are supporting the prime movers." So, amidst the public outcry, the U.S. government began making concessions. After all the committees and investigations, the USG concluded that more vigorous operational oversight and budgetary reporting from intelligence agency was required. It has since been alleged that it was at this time, under the new DCI and working with British intelligence and a previous DCIA, that the agency set up the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, Cayman Islands affiliate in the ICIC. They also had a branch in Tampa. It was to act as the base for an intelligence consortium among the British, the Americans, and the Arabs. Why there? The Cayman Islands? Well, the Cayman Islands, located in the Caribbean between Cuba, Honduras, and Nicaragua, is a British overseas territory with no real oversight or democracy. And why then? Well, the ex-head of Saudi intelligence said many years later, in 1976, the intelligence community was literally tied up by Congress. It could not do anything. It couldn't send spies. It couldn't write reports, and it couldn't pay money. In order to compensate for that, a group of countries got together and established what was called the Safari Club. Members of the Safari Club included France, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and Iran. As Halliwell's Castle Bank in Nassau was collapsing under the scrutiny of the IRS, the Nugenhan Bank in the Caymans was going from strength to strength. Michael Hand, aiming to take over as the CIA's banker, was employing former U.S. military and intel staff as if it were a part of the government retirement package. He employed ex and retired Pentagon counterinsurgency specialists, generals, OSS officers, RAND Corporation experts, CIA deputy directors and directors, and even a former chairman of the CAT. However, Nugenhan came under scrutiny almost immediately after concerns were raised with the FBI and the CIA over an agent who was officially working for the Office of Naval Intelligence but was unofficially running a network of cutouts and shell companies. An agent later described how Nugenhan was being used by the agency for shifting money for various covert operations around the globe. Before long, Sydney Police and Wall Street Journal had both started an investigation into Nugenhan in Australia. Evidence was uncovered suggesting that drugs were being trafficked from Southeast Asia, funded by Nugenhan, and involved ex-Special Forces and CIA in Laos. At the time, as this was going on, the IRS investigation into Castle Bank was quietly dropped amid suggestions of CIA pressure over national security concerns. So everyone involved in the CIA's covert actions seemed to be having a pretty tough time of it. Forced out of work by the same intrusive democratic oversight, some of the CIA's anti-Castro Cuban assets were looking for new jobs. They established the Coordination of Organization Revolucionarios Unidas, CORU. In Spanish is Coordinación de Organizaciones Revolucionarias Unidas, starting as an anti-Castro terrorist group. CORU immediately branched out into assassinations and bombings, targeting progressive movements across Latin America. And it was in this context that the CIA's Los Fresnos Bomb School training manual, many of you may remember it, was leaked out. The CIA just couldn't catch a break. The public discovered that the agency had been training South and Central American security and police forces in bomb making, improvised triggering devices, incendiarias, assassinations and weapons for assassinations, and more. The agency's response to having its affairs put under the public spotlight was to get better at outsourcing them and privatizing them. And as long as standing war against communism, most openly played out across the Golden Triangle, drew to a close, the CIA opened up in two new fronts. In 1978, in Nicaragua, the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, FSLN, after years of fighting, were beginning to effectively mobilize the people against the long-standing CIA puppet regime of Somoza. In response, the corrupt and brutal paramilitary force called Guardia was unleashed on the FSLN. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights investigated and reported on what appeared to be a mass killings and farm appropriations by the Guardia. Even the U.S. government had to eventually admit that that was happening, saying it appears that many of the allegations of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment during the course of National Guard operations against the Sandinistas were well-founded. And remember, these were the Somozans doing this. Okay. Then, in April 1979, the same month that 39th POTUS was publicly agreeing to support the Afghan resistance to the Soviet incursions, it was being reported that Mujahideen was trafficking opium. In May, a deal was agreed in Peshawar that the agency would vastly increase its presence in the region and work directly with the Pakistani military and the Mujahideen in a secret war against Russia. Apparently, having learned nothing of its experience in Laos 2 decades earlier, the CIA, on behalf of the U.S. government, made a contract with several major opium traffickers in the region. Shortly after the neighboring countries of Iran and Pakistan had banned opium production, the CIA had opened negotiations with one of the leading and notoriously violent drug traffickers in Afghanistan, Gulbuddin. Although one of the least popular warlords among the Afghan resistance, he made up for this by being one of the only ones who accepted the British-drawn Pakistan-Afghan border. So once again, the CIA, this time with the help of Pakistan, began supporting a local thug to develop his drug businesses into an international concern. And again, it wasn't long before the drug cartels from all over the world began getting involved. Within months, heroin processing facilities were popping up along the Afghan-Pakistan border and across into Pashtun tribal belt. In 1980, an advisor to POTUS pointed out that the glaring repetition of the failed foreign policy, asking if rather than going to Afghanistan to support the opium growers, shouldn't we try to avoid what we had done in Laos. By September 79, only 6 months after the Iranian Revolution, CIA analysts working out of the U.S. Embassy in Iran began reporting that under the new regime's oppression, the secret use of opium among the young had exploded. Imagine, huh? And consequently, the annual production had increased from 200 tons to 325 tons. A new opium golden triangle was coming into being between Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. It would be later called the Golden Crescent. Analysts predicted that once the Iranian opium was harvested, it would join the Afghan and Pakistan opium, and from there follow the Silk Road through Turkey and into Western Europe. And as 1979 drew to a close, and Russia began a full-scale invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, the 39th POTUS ignored all the warnings and responded by issuing sanctions against Russia and began officially arming the opium trafficking mujahideen. A few months earlier, in July of 1979, the president of Nicaragua, realizing that his days were numbered, met with U.S. ambassador to ask for support. During the recorded conversation, he reminded him of their decades-long anti-communist alliances, spanning 8 presidencies. He reminded him of how he had aided in the U.S.-led coup of Guatemala. He had sent troops to support the U.S. in the Dominican Republic and Vietnam, and had agreed to let them base bombers for the Bay of Pigs invasion in his country. It was to no avail. The regime and its Guardia were just too toxic for the new U.S. government to be seen supporting. So, on July 17th, 1979, President of Nicaragua, with his friends, family, and closest allies, were flown to Homestead Air Force Base in Florida. And as the Guardia were being overrun, he pleaded with Americans to help them. After you have spent 30 years educating all of these officers, I don't think it is fair for them to be thrown to the wolves. They have been fighting communism just like you taught them at Fort Golick, at Fort Benning, and at Leavenworth. Out of 900 officers, 800 or so were schooled by us. The sort of people he was trying to protect were people like the Meneses brothers, who had been central to much of the Guardia's criminal activity. A CIA and FBI investigation of Norwin Meneses in San Francisco in '68 had unearthed criminal charges dating back to the early '60s. The DEA knew Norwin Meneses was dealing drugs as early as '74, and by the end of '76, the Costa Rican DEA office had him on file as a cocaine supplier based in Managua. In '78, the FBI was aware that Norwin and his brother were bringing 20-kilo consignments of cocaine into the United States, where his nephew Jamie was distributing it in San Francisco. In '79, the Mexico City FBI office requested that Norman Meneses be issued an arrest warrant, and his immigration status put on hold so he could be stopped and questioned if he tried to enter the country. The U.S. Attorney in San Francisco refused the request, citing political connections in Nicaragua. Next, Danilo Blandon was a similar ilk. Part of the Nicaraguan ruling elite, he was the son of a wealthy landowner, the grandson of a former minister of war and Guardia commander. And he was married into one of the most prominent political families. When the regime started to crumble, Blandon got his pregnant wife and child into a Red Cross convoy bound for the airport. Then, while his family flew to Los Angeles to stay with relative, Danilo flew to Miami with his older brother. After a few weeks in Miami, he rejoined his family in what was then the most Hispanic East L.A. He quickly got a job as a used car salesman for 2 Nicaraguan brothers named Torres. The Torres brothers now were known by the local drug traffickers as the Trees, but the local cops knew them as the Twin Towers. The brothers were described as being at least 6'6", built like giant redwoods and significant cocaine traffickers. One of the brothers, Jacinto, was an ex-U.S. Marine who had served in Vietnam. The brothers lived with two sisters who were cousins of Pablo Escobar, of the soon-to-be created Medellin cocaine cartel. At the same time as the Somoza regime was being overthrown, a conference on cocaine was being held in Lima. Speaking there, Dr. Raul Jerry, a clinical psychologist from National University of San Marcos, Peru, claimed that as early as 1974, a new form of cocaine has swept through the most upmarket areas of Lima. It had only taken 2 years to go on to spread like grass fire through the major cities and on to Ecuador and Bolivia. Also giving evidence were two psychiatrists from La Paz, Bolivia, who reported the same pattern. They said that 80% of their patients were saying that they had been so desperate to buy more of the new drug that they had stolen, swindled, and sold their belongings. Dr. Jerry warned that in just 6 years, this new form of cocaine had gone from being unheard of to being the main drug reported in admissions to psychiatric hospitals and drug treatment centers. He warned that there was no part of Lima where youngsters weren't taking the drug and dealers weren't selling it by the loads. This new form of cocaine was called pasta básica de cocaína. Basco, or base. During the processing of cocaine leaves into powdered crystals, an intermediate paste was created. Now this paste, also known as bazooka. Compared with the powder, it was far cheaper, up to 4 times stronger, and when dried and smoked, took effect much quicker. It also wore off quicker and crashed the user back down harder. The only way to avoid overwhelming and paralyzing depression that followed was to quickly get another hit. In '74, drug traffickers in the Bay Area of San Francisco who had heard of the growing trend of smoking cocaine base with an accent over the E in South America wanted to give it a try. They looked up cocaine base without the accent in Merrick Manual. It told them that the base is the alkaloid of street cocaine once it's separated from hydrochloride salts. It was from cocaine base that the term freebase came. In '77, it was possible to buy kits in the U.S. to make cocaine base. Mercifully, it was still too expensive and required too much cocaine to make it feasible for most of the general population. Just a few weeks after the Lima Symposium, the Cocaine Task Force on House Select Committee on Narcotics Abuse and Control met. Attendees to the conference from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the White House, and the State Department reported back to the committee. Amongst them was Dr. Robert Bike of Yale University, who warned of a potentially catastrophic epidemic if the cocaine paste reached an unprepared U.S. population. Bike, supported by other conference attendees, pushed for a mass program of education in the states instead of pointless attempts to eradicate the growing of it in other countries. The committee and administration ignored him. And with the DEA formulated the Andean strategy, instead of research and public education, they would take military action in South and Central America, the very thing they had been warned would not work. For some reason, and for some time, one of the key lines of defense against socialist and nationalist liberation movements in South and Central America had been in the Latin American Anti-Communist Confederation, called CAL. CAL was the regional arm of the World Anti-Communist League, which was the international organization for far-right and right-wing political and financial interest groups and individuals from all over the world. The WACL was originally set up with CIA backing as a spinoff from the Asian People's Anti-Communist Government. The WACL had ties to the World Finance Corporation, Castle Bank, Financial General Bank Shares, that's a Washington-based bank holding company that would later be taken over by BCCI, Nelson Rockefeller, and now infamous campaign to re-elect a 37th POTUS. Cal had ties to all the military dictatorships, extreme right-wing military and paramilitary groups, and organized crime syndicates on the continent. And, of course, the CIA. Argentina's CIA, backed by a military junta, often hosted the meetings and conferences. When the CIA decided that narcotics trafficking could be the foundation on which their Latin American aspirations could be built, Cal jumped on board. Then, when the revolutionary nationalist Lydia Tejada, amidst a national movement of radicalized trade unions and indigenous peasants, became the first female president of Bolivia in November '79, the CIA and Cal moved quickly to put everything they needed in place to respond. So, in March 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero of San Salvador was shot through the heart while giving Mass. He had sent a letter to the 39th POTUS pleading for him to withdraw support of the brutal Salvadorian regime. The most likely funder of the assassination was the Salvadorian political Roberto Diablucian, a member of the WACL. Whack it, huh? And a publicly declared admirer of Nazi policies. He paid Colonel Ricardo Lau $120,000 3 days after the assassination. Lau, the ex-Nicaraguan intelligence officer under Somoza, was the leader of the Legion of September 15th, the forerunners to the Nicaraguan Contras. Most of the senior officers in the Legion had worked with the CIA in their previous intelligence and military roles under the deposed dictator. The CIA eventually admitted to knowing that the Legion were financing their bombings and hackings of civilian flights through kidnappings, extortions, robberies, and more. They never admitted to knowing about the assassination of Romero. In Bolivia, on July 17, 1980, General Luis Garcia Meza overthrew the dictatorship of General Banzer in a coup d'etat with the help of the Nazi war criminal Klaus Barbie and the financial backing of cocaine traffickers. It was later called the cocaine coup. The CIA had helped Klaus, the Butcher of Leon. Barber relocated to Bolivia, where he had worked throughout the 1970s for General Banzer. Since his relocation, in addition to working as a CIA asset under the alias Klaus Altman, he had also worked as a torturer, interrogator, provocateur, assassin, and counterintelligence operative in both Peru and Bolivia. Many years later, Pierre Dale Scott would quote Senate counsel Jack Bloom, who had said that their subcommittee had received testimony suggesting that the U.S. government had quietly encouraged the countries to act as our proxy, going on to explain how the Argentinian military and its intelligence service had been behind the Bolivian coup as part of this policy. In Bolivia now, Barbie ran a death squad called Los Novios de la Muerte, or the Grooms of Death. By the time of the cocaine coup, Los Novios were a paramilitary force of over 600 Nazi-worshipping international mercenaries. Ex-DEA agent Michael Levine, in his courageous expose of the CIA's role in the drugs trade, describes the events of the coup in shocking detail. By the evening of July 17, 1980, it was clear that the primary goal of the revolution was the protection and control of Bolivia's cocaine industry. All major drug traffickers in prison were released, after which they joined the neo-Nazis in their rampage. Government buildings were invaded, and traffickers' files were either carried off or burned. Government employees were tortured and shot. Women were tied and repeatedly raped paramilitaries, and the freed traffickers. The revolutionaries next turned to crushing the national strike. The Butcher of Leon was one of the many drivers of the coup. The U.S. government had helped the Argentinian junta to use the proceeds from the cocaine trafficking in Bolivia, laundered through a finance operation based out of Fort Lauderdale, to fund an anti-communist paramilitary group to fight covertly across the continent. Oh, I hear that break music. Going to take a quick break. We'll be right back right after.
At home for joining us this hour. We start tonight with some rather jaw-dropping information about American politics that has been reported out by a British news source. It's the BBC. The BBC has just aired a new documentary based on Oval Office tapes, which proves something about the American presidency and American modern history that even the most conspiratorial among us would not be able to believe were it not all captured on tape. But apparently, it's all captured on tape. Here's what happened. Okay, it's about the 1968 presidential election. In that election, the Democratic side was kind of in trouble in that the Democratic electorate was really split. They were not at all unified behind their candidate. On the right, Southern white Democrats, they were being peeled off to vote for George Wallace, the former Alabama governor. And so the Dixiecrats are getting peeled off from the Democrats that year. And also, different problem for the Democrats, people hated the Vietnam War. And the president at the time was a Democrat, Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ. The escalation in Vietnam was on him. So if you were against the war, as most Americans at that point were, this is the Gallup polling on the war at that time, this is the number of people who thought the war was a mistake, that number going up and up and up over time. If you were against the war, as increasingly everybody was, you were not psyched to vote for LBJ's successor in the Democratic Party. Right? So the Democrats were losing their appeal in the South because of race and racism, and they were losing the anti-war vote because Vietnam was their war. Well, the Republican candidate that year, trying to take advantage of that split on the Democratic side, was this handsome devil. Candidate Dick Nixon. Richard Nixon in 1968 was running against a Democratic Party that he knew was split. He was, in response, pledging to get rid of the draft. And he claimed to have a plan to end the war. He argued that if you wanted the war to end, you needed to elect him. You needed to vote the Democrats out of office because clearly LBJ and his party, the Democrats and their Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey, they had no idea how to end the war. If you wanted the war to end, what you needed was Nixon. What you needed was total change at the White House. The Democrats had to go so Dick Nixon could come in and end Vietnam. But then, less than a week before the election, it all went horribly wrong for Richard Nixon. Because less than a week before the election, it was 5 nights before Election Day, on Halloween night, 1968, the Democratic president, LBJ, went on TV in a surprise, nationally televised address. He made a surprise announcement that peace was at hand. The communist side, the North Vietnamese side, was going to make major concessions at peace talks. The U.S. anticipating that the other side, the South Vietnamese, were going to agree to a deal based on those concessions. Peace was at hand. The terms were all set. Peace was at hand. In recognition of the fact that peace was about to be declared, the United States would step back right away and stop all military operations in Vietnam. LBJ said that on a Thursday night. The election was going to be the following Tuesday. Turns out the Democrats do know how to end this war that the country hated. So this was bad news for Richard Nixon for that election, right? Bad news for Richard Nixon, but good news for the country who wanted the war to be over. Good news certainly for the people who were fighting the war. This was good news, right? Almost. Thursday night, LBJ made that announcement that peace was about to be agreed to by all sides in Vietnam. That was Thursday night. By Saturday morning, never mind. Deal was off. Peace was not at hand because the South Vietnamese side had decided actually it didn't want the deal. In fact, they didn't even want to talk about a deal. They pulled out of the peace talks. And so the war was back on. What happened? What happened between Thursday and Saturday? Now we know.
Hello. Good morning, Mr. President. How are you, my friend? Pretty good. Well, I've got one this morning that's pretty rough for you. We have found that our friend, the Republican nominee, our California friend, has been playing on the outskirts with our enemies and our friends both. He's been doing it through rather subterranean sources here. And he has been saying to the Allies that you're going to get sold out. You better not give away your liberty just a few hours before I can preserve it for you. Mrs. Chenault is contacting their ambassador. Now, this is not guesswork. Mrs. Chenault, she's young and attractive. I mean, she's a pretty good-looking girl. And she's around town. And she is warning them to not get pulled in on this Johnson move.
President Lyndon Baines Johnson, 1968, Saturday morning, November 1st, explaining to Senator Richard Russell what had gone wrong with this peace deal that everybody thought was going to end the war. I mean, LBJ had been so sure this was going to end the war that he went on TV Thursday night and told the country the war was going to end. Peace was at hand. The reason peace did not happen, is what he was explaining on the phone, is that the Republican nominee for president that year, Richard Nixon, had intervened in the peace talks to blow them up. He used an intermediary who was involved in the talks to approach the South Vietnamese side and tell them, don't do it. Approach them and tell them to pull out and not agree to a deal. He told them this deal being worked out by LBJ, this whole deal to end the war, these peace talks in Paris, is not going to be a good deal for them. They should not participate. They should just wait until after the election when he, Richard Nixon, would be president, and he'd give them a much better deal. Johnson was going to sell them out. He, Richard Nixon, was the one who they should deal with. Nixon's intermediary was actually caught on tape telling the South Vietnamese ambassador, just hang on through the election. Hang on, don't end the war. We need the war to keep going through the election. It's outrageous, right? I mean, the war could have ended. It was on the verge of ending, except a candidate for office in our country thought that the war ending would help his opponent in the election. He thought he'd have a better chance of getting elected if the war kept going. And so, while saying he wanted the war to end, he did what he could to keep it going when it otherwise would have ended. It is astonishing. And President Johnson thought so, too, at the time. We now know.
And they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason, I know. I think it would shock America if a principal candidate was playing with a source like this on a matter this important. Yeah.
President Lyndon Johnson there on the same day as that earlier tape, remarking that as far as he can tell, this is treason. I do not think he is saying that hyperbolically. He says it repeatedly on these tapes. He thinks that what has happened there, an American politician purposely prolonging the war and stopping the peace for his own purposes, he thinks that is a hanging offense. He thinks that is treason. This was 4 days before the election that year. Having thought that the war was going to be over, that a peace deal had been negotiated, now the president finds out that the peace deal fell through because a candidate who wanted there not to be peace before the election intervened to make one side walk away. Now, why didn't LBJ say anything publicly? I mean, this is right before the election. Can you imagine how the country would have reacted to that? This is a war the whole country was against. It was going to be over, except candidate Dick Nixon intervened to undo the peace deal and keep the war going. Can you imagine how angry the American public would have been? But LBJ did not say anything publicly at the time because he thought that he couldn't. And the reason he thought he couldn't is because of the way he found out what Nixon had done. The FBI illegally wiretapped the phones of the South Vietnamese ambassador. That's how we knew. We couldn't let anybody know that we were illegally listening into the ambassador's phone lines, and so they couldn't let anybody know what it was they heard illegally while they were illegally listening in on the ambassador's phone lines. And so Nixon got away with it. And the October surprise, the Halloween night surprise that the Democrats' war was ending right before the election, that October surprise ended up getting undone. The war did keep going, and anybody who was anti-war in the country really did have no reason at all to vote for a Democrat. And so, yes, the Republican, Richard Nixon, won. It worked. Richard Nixon got elected, barely. Squeaked by, but he won, in part on the basis of the idea that he was the guy who knew how to end the war, not those dumb Democrats. And of course, Nixon did not know how to end the war. He sure knew how to keep it going, but he didn't know how to end it. He didn't have a plan. And instead of the war ending on Halloween in 1968, the war went on for 5 more years while he was president, in which time more than 15,000 Americans were killed, as were untold numbers of Vietnamese. So that happened. That actually happened. And now, in 2013, what are we supposed to do with that information? LBJ is dead. Nixon is dead. Hubert Humphrey is dead. George Wallace is dead. 15,000 Americans are dead who otherwise would not have been because of what happened. All the Vietnamese who died. How does this get made right? It cannot be made right in the most basic sense that the people who died needlessly because of this duplicitous political decision cannot be brought back from the dead. You also can't get revenge. You can't indict Nixon's ghost. But you can't refuse to let him get away with it again. You can't make sure it is part of the way that we at least tell his history and the history of that war and the history of modern American politics. You have to include it in the history, both so nobody gets away with it in the long run the way he did in the short run, but also so we don't do it again. So we at least know something like this is possible. So we at least don't dismiss this kind of possibility as some conspiracy theory bit of nonsense. So we at least know there is precedent, modern precedent, for this particular kind of craven evil.
Those dirty bastards. Listen, if you want more information about what we're talking about today, about the CIA and the government and actually the vice president and his crew, involvement in illicit drug trade, you can go to chiptatum.com. There is a book there in the bookstore. It's called The Tatum Chronicles. The Tatum Chronicles is nothing more than my flights in Honduras and Nicaragua in the 80s, flying drugs for the United States government under the auspices of the CIA, the DIA, and the Enterprise. It's there, all in black and white, real live flight plans, with notes on the back of those flight plans, what was on board, and more than that, on the front of the flight plan, our passenger list was there. You'll be pretty amazed at who we were flying around down in Nicaragua, Honduras, Panama, and Costa Rica. Feel free to pick it up. chiptatum.com, just click on the bookstore and you can pick it up right there. Okay, back to the show. On the 17th of September 1980, the deposed president of Nicaragua was killed, and Colonel Bermudez of the Guardia, who some allegedly was a full-time CIA asset, was appointed as lead of the legion September 15th. Describing Bermudez, one USG official said he fit the profile. He was malleable, controllable, docile. It helped that Enrique Bermudez had a long-standing relationship with the U.S. government, having aided us in the 1965 invasion of the Dominican Republic. Competing with the Legion was the UDN, National Democratic Union, who were fundraising and equipping military groups based in Honduras called FARN, Revolutionary Armed Forces of Nicaragua. The UDN FARN were gaining a lot of support from the anti-Castro Cuban community in Miami, with some Bay of Pigs veterans actively volunteering. Moving forward, November 1980, the U.S. presidential election took place. While in Iran, 52 U.S. citizens were being held hostage. It has been shown that the Republican candidate and his running mate, the ex-DCI, feared that if the hostages were released in October, Carter would be reelected, and Reagan and Bush would not take office. At the time, the state of anti-White House sentiment within the agency was widespread after having their resources and manpower drastically cut in response to the oversight requirements of the various committees that sat in the mid-1970s. Remember, that happened in about 76. Over a decade later, allegations surfaced that the Iranian government were offered $40 million and the promise of arms sales if they delayed the release and the Republican candidate was elected. On the day of the new president's inauguration, the hostages were released. Shortly afterwards, large arms sales with Iran were agreed to. Many years later, congressional investigation found no evidence of CIA conspiracy to fix that U.S. election. In March 81, the government authorized the agency to undermine the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Arms shipments to Sandinista allies in El Salvador were stopped, and the agency made contact with anti-Sandinista groups dotted across the Americas. By the middle of 81, the agency was bringing the various disparate groups together in the Fuerza Democrática Nicaragüense, FDN. What would later become known as the Contras was largely made up of the military and fundraising arms of the Legion of September 15th and the UDN-FARN. Those are the former Somoza military attaches, the former Somoza military personnel who were in charge of all the atrocities earlier. The Somoza military attaché to Washington and the CIA asset, Enrique Bermudez, was tasked with leading all of them. Bermudez and the Meneses family had been close friends and business associates in LaGuardia. In September 81, the CIA head office was informed that the Contras were going to start smuggling narcotics into the USA in order to finance their operations against the Sandinista government, having already one successful trial run. That same year, according to two different former CIA operatives, two meetings were held, one earlier in the year and one at the end of it. These meetings were allegedly to have been set up by CIA to organize the major cocaine dealers in Colombia into a cartel. U.S. and Israeli intelligence personnel were working directly with the Central and South American traffickers. In the first meeting, 20 of the largest Colombian traffickers attended, and in the second meeting, it was attended by closer to 200. The main source of the cartel's cocaine was to be Bolivia, and the main customer base to be the American people. Once the logistics of the cartel had been agreed, there was a small matter of security. Each member that agreed to join the Medellin cartel paid an annual membership fee of $35,000 to bankroll a paramilitary security force. Muerte de los secuestradores, death to the kidnappers, or MAS, was established at these meetings. MAS was a Colombian death squad bolstered with Israeli and British mercenaries, bankrolled with cocaine trafficking profits, and tasked with assassinating left-wing politicians, trade unionists, activists, guerrillas, organized peasants, and anyone trying to undermine the Colombian cocaine trade. Now, you all know and you all have heard about the kidnappings and death of missionaries and teachers in those zones. The problem was the missionaries and teachers would tell their students if there's something going on, if they see some drug trade going on, report it to the police. Thus, they wrote their own death sentence. Jumping back to California, Norwin Meneses had been given the job of Bermudez's intelligence and security advisor, with some suggesting that he was at that stage already recruiting fighters for the Contras. Blandon would later claim by the end of 81, the Meneses organization had already trafficked 900 kilos of cocaine into the U.S., earning in the region of $54 million. In December, Reagan sent his DCI to inform Congress that he had approved an intelligence finding on Nicaragua. The presidential approval and the informing of Congress meant that the CIA was from that point on officially in charge of the Contras, strategy, tactics, recruitment, logistics, supplies, funding, and they could not be charged with any crimes, nor could they actually be investigated for any crimes. In 1982, a FBI report came across the wires that stated that Meneses had a reputation in Nicaragua as being a hitman. That same year, his nephew was negotiating with the National Military Police of Honduras to purchase 10 to 20 kilos per month of seized cocaine to traffic into the States. Blandon himself later admitted to having been funded the Contras with proceeds from the cocaine trafficking as early as '82. It was around that time that Ronald J. Lister appeared to be working with Blandon. Lister spent the next 7 years helping Blandon with logistics and weapons. The CIA later denied having any knowledge of or relationship with Mr. Lister. However, recently released documents show that William Earl Nelson, former Deputy Director of Operations for the CIA, met with Lister several times. Imagine that. 1982, Santa Monica, California. Yet another cocaine conference. Dr. Jerry once again warned of potential crack epidemic in the U.S. He said that trivializing its use was dangerous. How nothing they had done had stopped 50 to 80% relapse rates once people were hooked, and how doing nothing would be like unleashing a plague. Instead, the mainstream media reported that trivial witticisms of attendee Timothy Leary. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, Blandon had found Freeway Ricky Ross, who was already turning cocaine into smokable crack. Blandon went from trafficking and distributing 1 to 2 kilo packages to multi-million-dollar loads that wouldn't fit into a wheelbarrow, but would fit into a big white cooler. And in Miami, the newly formed Medellin cartel were shipping unheard-of quantities through the Bahamas using special go-fast boats and planes and radar avoidance techniques. One of those pilots, codenamed Swordfish, worked with the CIA. By 1982, rumors had already started surfacing that one of the biggest South American cocaine production labs in Bolivia was being run by the CIA to help fund off-the-book operations. Those operations were run by now ex-Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Apparently, North was using a DEA asset's 2 seafood companies as fronts for the Contras supply network moving drugs and arms. Then, when Newsweek reported that the U.S. government was officially supporting the Contras, several politicians launched a campaign to stop it. On Christmas Eve '82, the Boland Amendment was passed, stating that U.S. taxpayers would not fund activities intended to overthrow the Nicaraguan government or entice a war between Honduras and Nicaragua. Internal memos showed that the CIA, the White House, the Defense Department, and supporters of the Contras in Congress all knew that there was absolutely no chance that the Contras could overthrow the Sandinista government with or without their support. Therefore, continuing to fund them would breach the terms of Boland. It was business as usual. The case can now be made that in terms of the relationship between the CIA and the Contras and the cocaine business, a lot of senior people in the White House, the military, and the CIA knew about it, profited from it, while it was going on. After Boland, agency money was flooding into the Contras. At exactly the same time, according to some, that the CIA were already using the Ilopango airstrip in El Salvador as a supply base for the Contras and a transit point for U.S.-bound narcotics. Eyewitnesses, me one, at the base claimed that the pilots there were openly talking about the fact that they were flying drugs into the U.S. and cash into Panama, while loading and unloading their illicit cargoes in plain sight of everyone. Then in February 1983, a large cocaine ring in San Francisco was shut down. Amongst the 20 arrests were several Nicaraguans with ties to the Contras leader, Sanchez. While the U.S. media didn't make the connection for 3 years, the Nicaraguan press made it within weeks. It has since been claimed that the DEA knew Blandon and his wife were drug traffickers before the State Department even granted them political asylum. In '83, there was no doubt Blandon told the CIA that Bermudez had told him that it was no longer necessary for him to fundraise for the Contras, as the CIA were now funding them and the drugs were flowing. According to Meneses, Blandon never stopped sending money. By '83, Blandon had been selling cocaine to Ricky Ross for at least a year, who in turn had established a crack empire from L.A. The DEA estimated that Ross's sales went from around 40 kilos to 1.25 million doses of crack every month, to 200 kilos per month, and then on to an eye-washing 600 kilos per month, or 15 million doses. This was at the same time Blandon and Lister had started supplying the LA gangs with automatic rifles, submachine guns, walkie-talkies, pagers, police scanners, voice scramblers, cellular phones, and anti-eavesdropping equipment. Now, if I were sitting out there and hearing this for the first time, I would ask myself, where the heck did they get all that equipment? Well, remember who his partner was. Our Mr. Lister was the ex-deputy director of operations for the Central Intelligence Agency. He had access to anything and everything he needed. He worked directly for the Vice President of the United States of America and interfaced with Colonel Oliver North. And because he owned a private intelligence company, there was no oversight. You're listening to All News Network and the Veterans Truth Radio Network. My name is Chip Tatum. That's it for now. Remember, please join us every Wednesday evening, 7 p.m., All News Network. Until next week, hasta luego from beautiful Ecuador.